third aspect that Muslims think guarantees their isnad chains is what they call liqa. Liqa is the idea that two people in the chain actually met and were contemporaries of one another. But the massive problem with that, and this is what Muslim scholars don't tell Muslims, and it's what Muslim da'i never tell any of us, is that in their methodology, possibility equals reality. In other words, they take it for granted that if two people could have met, that means that they did in fact meet. Now, anyone with a brain can immediately see how ridiculously stupid the assumption of Imam Bukhari was. And this assumption has been adopted by Muslims at large. Just because two people lived in a city does not mean that they actually spoke to one another. And even if they spoke to one another, it does not mean that they spoke about the thing that the person claims that they heard from the other person. These are giant assumptions made in isnad logic. Furthermore, there is no isnad chain preserved in the document evidence. There's no list of names that gets bigger and bigger down through the centuries. There's no synoptic lists that we can put next to one another to see that how they were growing down through the centuries. And even if maybe there is a fragment of something somewhere, it by no means covers the entire corpus. And to that fact, let me ask this question. Muslims believe that their guided caliphs compiled the Quran because the Quran was in danger of being lost as a transmission at the time of Uthman, when Muslims were on the borders to invade Christian Armenia. And to secure it, Uthman came out with a revised Quran, a revised edition of the Quran. If the Hadiths were so important to Islamic doctrine, why was there no effort, no systematic effort to compile the Hadiths when they are a much larger corpus until nearly 200 years after Muhammad's death? That tells us that the value of Hadiths within Islamic doctrine grew over those 200 years. It elevated itself over those 200 years, and that in original proto-Islam, they were not as valued. Now, the next problem is the matin of the Hadiths. That, for those of you that don't know, is the substance content of the Hadiths. So, it's the main text. It's talking a bit that Muhammad actually did. However, we know that Hadith reports evolved. Why did they evolve? What were the pressures that led to their evolution? The first pressure was sectarian differences between Muslims themselves. Shia and Sunni argued over pretty much everything, and still do. And each group created hadiths to support their position. Secondly, was divisions and differences between and within different Muslim communities. If you look at the four madhabs of classical Islam that have survived into the current time, they disagree on just about everything. And each of them refer to hadiths to support their position. And so, ladies and gentlemen, these disagreements led to the creation of fictional hadiths. And there were theological and Sharia fiqh based reasons for the creation of hadiths. And the system to filter fake from real hadiths came too late. It came 200 years too late, because Sunnis and Shias split in the 7th century, but the science of hadith was not canonized until the 9th and 10th century. And the madhabs, with all their peculiar arguments, had already formed with their different methodologies of fiqh, which is the methodology of deciding Sharia law. They'd already formed before the 10th century. And so the science for filtering fake from real hadith, fake from da'if, came too late to guarantee that the current corpus of hadith is not actually penetrated completely with fictions and lies. Furthermore, there's no awareness of the redaction layers of hadith. So, for example, the Western historian on Islam, G.H.A. Junbal and Harold Motsky, showed that hadiths were often the subject of gradual development, with isnads added retrospectively. When you look at Bukhari and Muslim and their method, they tried to reconstruct earlier form. There was no attempt by those imams to reconstruct earlier forms of the hadiths. And so, layers and modulations of hadith stories developed and were included in the hadith literature. Any questions on that point before I move on to my next point? Yes. The reason why so few women are involved in the telling of the story of Muhammad in the isnad chains is because Muhammad said in his hadith that women were deficient in their religion. He said that their intellect was only worth half that of a man. He said that the testimony of a woman was only worth half that of a man. Now, the exceptions were given to women who were directly associated to Muhammad. Why? Because of that association. So there are thousands of hadith connected to Aisha, but there are not countless women in the isnad chain going from Aisha. What? Did Aisha not have girlfriends? Did she not talk to other women? Aren't those women competent to remember those stories? Why is it goes Aisha, man. Why? Because under Islamic Sharia law, the witness of a woman is worth half that of a man. So you would need two women to testify to every story that one man could testify to in the hadith. That's why if a woman is raped under Sharia law, she needs 4 female witnesses to justify in a Sharia court that she has actually been raped. This is how backward Islam is. By comparison, if you read the Gospels, the very first witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ were women. And the entire Christian faith begins with the witness of women, ladies and gentlemen. And that is despite the fact that in that time and period in Jewish culture, the witness of a woman counted for nothing at all. But in the Christian community, because we raised women up to equal dignity of men, that the entire witness of men is equal to that of women. And so the faith of Christianity is born of the witness of women.
But I have a right to...
Any other questions on this topic?
No, not a question, but something to say on Aisha.
Yeah.
That's one hadith that I do believe, where she doubts the Prophet Muhammad's...
Why doesn't the church pay taxes?
Where she says, your Lord hates...
Why don't you pay taxes?
Yes.
Himself.
Look how big your belly is.
Now, ladies and gentlemen. Now, ladies and gentlemen. Let's be clear. I am not stood here saying that every story about Muhammad is false. I believe that there probably are some true stories where, for instance, there is corroboration between the Quran and the Hadith. And I mean direct corroboration, not tangential corroboration. I believe there was a living tradition around Muhammad that probably did survive, though malformed, into the present. But I say to you that even the embarrassing stories about Muhammad were probably made by Christian converts to Islam or Zoroastrian converts to Islam who did it under duress and resented their conversion. And thus they started embarrassing hadiths about Muhammad, attached it to believed isnad chains, popularized it, and then some scholar, because it helped them to look all scholarly, started talking about it because the science of hadith is pointless and useless.
Well, why are you so violent?
So,
Why did your friend...
ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen,
Forget about this.
I'll move on to the next point. Even your girlfriend is asking you to shut up. Even your girlfriend is asking you to behave like a man and not a child, so she doesn't have to be stood next to an emotional toddler. You are embarrassing your woman. Have some damn self-respect.
Aren't you emotional?
Now, ladies and gentlemen. Now, ladies and gentlemen. Believe me, bro. Every day of the week, I am 3 times the man that you will ever be.
How'd you know that?
Now, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't mock children getting raped. You do. Now, let's go on. Let's go on, ladies and gentlemen. This next point is quite damning of the Islamic method. Muslims use a process called Ijma. Now, Ijma, on paper, means the consensus of the Muslim community. But ever aware of a bad idea in Islam and the Quran and the Hadith, the scholars of Islam have bravely stepped forward to give their interpretation of Ijma as not being the consensus of the Muslim community, but the consensus of the scholarly Muslim community. Which raises the obvious question, whose scholars? The scholars of the Salafi, the scholars of the Ash'ari, the scholars of the Sufi, the scholars of the Ismaili, the scholars of the Ahmadiyya, the scholars of the Abadi. Whose scholars are we supposed to trust? Like, whose hadith chains are we supposed to trust? Whose hadiths are we supposed to trust? It's a completely subjective criterion, and it simply depends in which tradition you were brought up. However, consensus is hardly ever evident. Go and look at the madhabs like I have. Look at any question and virtually they'll disagree. They'll disagree on just about everything.
That's why religion is flawed.
And then those disagreements get even worse when you look at the different sects of Islam.
But Christianity's got the
They disagree on their doctrines. They disagree on their practices. They disagree on all of these things, showing that there is no ijma. There is no consensus, ladies and gentlemen. Furthermore, consensus is not equal to independent verification. Independent verification is always better than consensus. We know, as people practiced in democracy, that groups can agree upon bad ideas. Don't believe me? Look at Nazi Germany. Groups can agree upon error, and we can look at Islamic tradition and see that Muslims change their mind. If you compare the Sirat autobiographical literature of early Islam that predates the Hadiths of Imam Bukhari and Muslim, those early Sirat literature is on the whole rejected, even though it's an earlier source. In other words, the later historical records of Hadith outrank the biographies of the Sirah, even though the stories of the Sirah and the stories of the Hadith supposedly arrived in the same way, people remembering. And that decision was made because later generations found earlier reports embarrassing. We see another example of this happening right now, today, in front of all of our eyes. Muslims embarrassed about the fact that Muhammad married a prepubescent child who was unable to consent to marriage, and then had sex with that child when she had precocious puberty, which is a malfunction of the human body, and had sex with a child unable to bear children, who was made infertile because of his actions, have now, today, in our time, started to say that the hadiths that tell the story can't be trusted. And so Muslim doctrine and Muslim beliefs in hadiths are always modulated by the pressure that the Muslim community feels. Right now, Prince Solomon of Saudi Arabia, the ruler of Saudi Arabia, has taken virtually all the hadiths and kicked them in the bin. because he wants to liberalize Saudi Arabia. And he is arguing that most hadiths can't be trusted. There are entire groups of Muslims called Quranists who have chucked the hadiths in the bin. Now, the historical method used by the West values things like the criterion of embarrassment. So, for example, when the Gospel said that a woman testified about the resurrection, in those days that would have been an embarrassing testimony, because women were considered unreliable witnesses in those days. But for Christians, we did not have those values. So we pinned the resurrection to the testimony of the women and the empty tomb and then the apostles. And so the criterion of embarrassment is a criterion used by Western historiographers, because religions don't make up embarrassing stories about their leaders. Yes? So they tell good stories about their leaders, not bad stories about their leaders. And that's why if a story is embarrassing in the context that it was made, it would be considered embarrassing, and thus more likely to be true. Also, in Western historiography, we favor falsification. Falsification means that if there's outside evidence that falsifies a claim that will be based upon a reasonable bias, there is a reason to distrust the reasonable bias. Furthermore, Western historiographers look for earliest sources and independent sources. Firstly, Islamic Hadith literature is not early. And even if the stories were secured in an isnad chain, most Sunni hadiths rely on the same 6 people that were all in bed with one another. And so they were all in the same place at the same time in communication with one another. Whereas the gospel writers were at the same time writing in different places. Furthermore, we also have Pauline literature, Lucian literature, Mark literature, and then literature outside of the Bible by people like Suetonius and Josephus and Celsus and others like the Church Fathers, like Clement of Rome, that all talk independently about the same events, like the crucifixion. Furthermore, in the Hadith literature, we have evidence of corruption. For example, there are synoptic hadiths that contradict one another about particular facts. These synoptic hadiths only come to light because they exist, and thus the scholars assess the contradiction and then say, we believe this version, not that version. But they're only aware of them because of the contradiction. That means that it is quite possible that fake hadiths entered into the corpus that are not contradicted by other contradictory hadiths. In other words, errors in the hadith literature that have no contradiction, and so their fakeness can never be questioned. They're standalone reports. Furthermore, there's clear fabrication and fictional stories in the hadiths, such as the fact that the hadiths give a report about a Roman emperor and private correspondence of a Roman emperor and a private meeting of a Roman emperor without any possibility that any of the people who heard that report could have had access to either the meeting or the correspondence. In other words, it was propaganda made up to dishearten Byzantine Christians who were at war and occupied by Muslim forces. Furthermore, there are hadiths that directly contradict the Quran. The Quran is the only 7th century Muslim document that we have. There is no 7th century Muslim document of the Hadith. But there are Hadiths that contradict the Quran. The Quran says Muhammad will not perform any miracle, and that his only miracle is the Quran itself. But the Hadiths report miracles of Muhammad. Why do you think that was? I'll tell you why. Because when the Muslims conquered and occupied and began to Arabize Christian populations in the Middle East, the first thing that the Christians said was, "What miracles did your prophet perform to show that he was from God?" And the Muslims opened up their Quran and found nothing. And so they started to make up stories about miracles to show that Muhammad was a prophet from God. And for these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, every Muslim, God's miracles can be found in the Gospels as performed by Jesus Christ. They can be found in the Old Testament record as performed by his prophets. Muhammad was a false prophet. Now, another reason why Muslims can abandon the belief in the Hadith. Muslims have codified the collections like Bukhari and Muslim with quasi-canonical authority, which means that there is an internal pressure amongst Muslims not to evaluate these texts through the historical method. By fixing them as canonical authorities, it suppresses debate about their reliability and evaluation of their historical accuracy amongst the Muslim community. I want to point out that all the major hadith reports were written centuries too late, outside of the Arabian Peninsula, by people who never ever met Muhammad. That's roughly akin to me writing a biography of Charlemagne today, using only oral reports and telling you, "Believe me, bro, I heard it from good people." Any questions on that point before I move on to my next point? Yeah, go on.
When you talk about Islamic methodology, are you talking about tradition or principle? Second question, sorry. Western methodology is scientific methodology. Why religious are irrational? So then same logic is applied to Hadith and the Bible.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, guys, if you two want to debate, you want to take it over there. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear. This presentation has been brought about because a famous Muslim scholar, Dr. Yasser Qadhi of America, has said that according to the Western historical method, Hadith literature and Sirat literature would not pass the test of the Western historical method. That's quite a statement. It's essentially saying that according to the Western historical method, Muslim sources can't be trusted. And I'm explaining why they can't be trusted from the Western historical method. But, ladies and gentlemen, I want to be clear before anyone accuses me of bias. The Western historical method was invented by people who wanted to attack Christianity. They were not friends of Christianity. I am not using a method built by Christians to attack non-Christians, but built by deists and atheists to attack Christianity. But when you use that historical method and apply it to the life of Jesus and the life of Muhammad, the life of Jesus is considered much more reliable than the life of Muhammad. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, Western historians, when they want to know about Jesus, they will go to the Gospels. Western historians, when they want to know about Muhammad's life, say, this is what Muslims tell us, not what we can believe from this Hadith literature, because it does not pass the test of Western historiography. You had a question.
We had outside historic facts that have been recorded. Are there any that record the facts and miracles from the Hadiths?
I want to be clear. There is virtually zero support for the main claims of Islam. Virtually zero support that Mecca was a 7th century established settlement. Virtually zero support for the claim that Muhammad was a prophet that did any of the things claimed about him in the Hadith literature. But, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to Jesus Christ, we have extra biblical support that he was a teacher, that he was called the Messiah, that he had Gentile and Jewish followers, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that he was worshipped as a god. These are all the essential claims of the Christian faith. And so, by the historical method, Christianity stands tall as Islam's hadiths fall and fall and fall.